Johnson and his men hid in ditches and opened fire on the approaching vehicle filled with RAF men. The car was damaged, toppled, and added to the blockade. At least 4 RAF troops were wounded and taken prisoner. Several others were killed, and the Japanese paratroopers executed the prisoners. When more vehicles arrived, the P1 evacuation was underway. One fuel truck passed through the barrier but was later hit by hand grenades, lost control, and overturned without exploding. It trapped a man underneath and blocked the road further. Men from other vehicles took cover in ditches and forests, and some armed evacuees began fighting back. Meanwhile, Dutch soldiers in Palembang tried to organize reinforcements. Air Commander Esta Vincent and his driver gathered 3 truckloads of Dutch troops and a van full of food and led a convoy north toward P1. After about 9 miles, the convoy encountered the enemy roadblock and was immediately attacked. Without exchanging fire, most trucks turned back and retreated to Palembang. The food van ended up in a ditch. Vincent described feeling ashamed and disgusted. Around noon, 2 armored cars and 4 army trucks carrying about 150 Dutch soldiers arrived at the barricade and attempted another reinforcement. Lieutenant Okamoto was supported by more Japanese paratroopers emerging from the woods. The Japanese launched a grenade, pistol, and rifle firestorm at the convoy and the overturned fuel truck. Most of the armored car crews and a truckload of soldiers abandoned their vehicles and retreated to town, making up most of the killed and wounded. Lieutenant Okamoto was injured and 2 paratroopers were killed in the firefight, but the Japanese held the blockade, driving the Dutch out and seizing the armored car. Major Kimura, dropped southeast with about 25 men from the 4th Rifle Company, arrived at the roadblock after 1:30 p.m. Kimura decided to maintain the blockade to prevent reinforcements from Palembang and to intercept evacuating forces heading south. He positioned soldiers to guard the roadblock and used the stolen armored car to send Lieutenant Oki and 20 men north toward P1 to capture the Dutch airfield office about 1 mile south of the airstrip. Shortly after, Colonel Combs' transport carrying his staff, a 37mm anti-tank gun, and personnel crashed several kilometers southeast of P1. Trapped in a damp forest, Combs struggled through the night to rejoin his troops. Lieutenant Oki and his armored car company encountered 300 Dutch soldiers and airmen evacuating the airfield after traveling nearly 3 miles toward P1. The evacuation was in full progress. The Japanese used the armored car's guns to fire on the retreating troops, forcing them backward. Additional paratroopers from both western and southeastern groups arrived at the airstrip and joined the assault. Lieutenant Gamo of the 2nd Rifle Company gathered 16 soldiers west of the airstrip and moved east. Upon reaching the edge, they attacked despite being armed only with pistols and grenades. Lieutenant Gamo threw a grenade at a British anti-aircraft station and was killed almost immediately. The others pressed on more cautiously. Around 2 p.m., Lieutenant Hiros, commander of the 2nd Rifle Company, arrived at the airstrip with 2 men. They moved toward a Dutch barracks but suddenly encountered about 300 Dutch troops, possibly those Lieutenant Oki had attacked. Outnumbered, Hiros wisely withdrew into the woods. The fight intensified at the barricade near Palembang, where Dutch forces and armed RAF men confronted the Japanese roadblock. Snipers engaged the Japanese, who crept through the jungle to observe the enemy. A small group attempted to set the overturned fuel tanker on fire, but were warned by injured Allied soldiers that a surviving RAF member was trapped beneath. Japanese mortar shells began falling as enemy machine gun fire tore through the trees. The group quickly abandoned their goal and ran into a nearby march. Major Cura and the others were eventually driven out by the Dutch and RAF riflemen, who had gained the upper hand at the roadblock. Sadly, the RAF trooper stranded beneath the gasoline tanker had already passed away by the time the rescue crew arrived. By 6 a.m., Lieutenant Oki had driven out the 300 Dutch and RAF offenders and taken control of the airport office with his 20 patrol troopers and a commander armored car. Oki sent the armored car back toward the barrier to report his success, leaving a few men behind to defend the office while he led the remaining men north toward the airfield. Flying Officer Mamara, who had escaped from P1, and others gathered at the roadblock when the captured armored vehicle suddenly appeared. When the Allied riflemen realized the car was in Japanese hands, they opened fire, causing the driver to crash into other vehicles. The Allies initially thought the Dutch had broken through, but many Japanese soldiers revealed themselves from the roadside and threw hand grenades. Realizing their luck was running out, the Japanese tried to break away but were met with heavy gunfire from small arms. A small number of armed British airmen moved toward P1, possibly sensing the airfield might be under Japanese control, but they soon encountered Japanese paratroopers left to protect the airfield and the captured airport office. A protracted engagement followed until about 20 Dutch reinforcements arrived, one armed with a Bren gun, helping overthrow the strongly defended position. Meanwhile, paratroopers continued arriving from dispersed drop zones near the airstrip and attacking the defenders. By late afternoon, most Allied defenders had either died or fled the airport, leaving only a few Dutch soldiers and roughly 60 armed RAF members who held on stubbornly despite running low on ammunition. RAF ground crew were ready and stuck to their posts, mowing down Japanese as they landed. Leslie Baker recalled the RAF alone eliminated many Japanese paratroopers, though not without casualties. The primary vehicle trying to move two 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns to safety arrived at the Palembang main road, but none of the guns made it out. One had to be abandoned after light machine gun fire riddled its tires. The paratroopers captured all the weapons after disabling most of the 12. Wing Commander H.J. Maguire and Platoon Officer O.D. Creon believed troops were coming to Palembang during a brief break in fighting and hurried down the road, mistaking 60 to 70 Japanese soldiers congregating in the street for Dutch reinforcements. Realizing they couldn't win alone, Maguire and Creon dropped their weapons and pretended to surrender. They bluffingly demanded the Japanese officers surrender, claiming to have a sizable force. The Japanese officer said he would give safe conduct if they marched out. After returning to their guns, the two officers calmly walked back to the airfield. Upon arrival, they found the few remaining troops had burned unusable aircraft and set fire to the fuel dump. With the help of remaining vehicles, about 60 resilient defenders escaped north toward Jambi, followed closely by Maguire and Creon. By 5 p.m., P1 was empty of Allied soldiers. Lieutenant Heros and his 3 men found deserted barracks and discovered remaining sea ration supplies, a fortunate find given they had only rice wafers and dry compressed fish. Major K.R.A., who spent the day consolidating small groups of paratroopers into larger formations, reached the airstrip an hour later. Everything was silent. All Allies were either dead or escaped. By nightfall, P1 was controlled by about 102nd Rating Regiment Army paratroopers. On February 14, 1942, at 11:30 a.m., 6 transports dropped Lieutenant NCO and his 60 men from the 1st and 2nd platoons of the 1st Rifle Company near the Shell Oil BPM facilities on the west bank of the Searing River. At the same time, others were dropped south of the Standard Oil NPM complex on the east side of the Searing. Despite fire from refinery gunners and anti-aircraft guns, none of the tankers were damaged. One Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber carrying cargo containers was shot down. The soldiers landed in a shallow wetland and quickly found their guns and supplies, unlike the paratroopers at P1 who landed in tall grass or jungle, making cargo hard to locate. A group of 6 men under Lieutenant Tawaga advanced rapidly toward the nearest part of the BPM refinery near the confluence of the Mosai and Searing rivers. They overran a pillbox at the southwest corner of the facility, then moved into a nearby residential area where they encountered about 60 Dutch soldiers armed with machine guns. Tawaga and his men took cover and returned fire. Lieutenants Ogawa and Yoko were organizing stragglers as Tawaga pressed into the refinery. After 2 hours, Ogawa and Nuka ascended the central topping tower and hoisted the rising sun flag, while Tawaga kept the Dutch engaged. Seeing the flag, Tawaga and his platoon, now joined by Lieutenant Nau, moved toward the tower and observed the Dutch closing valves, cranking machinery, and removing demolition charges as the Japanese raised their flag. The Dutch and British launched a counter-offensive using air raid shelters as pillboxes, leading to fierce fighting across the compound. Bullets pierced fuel pipes, causing thick black oil to spill and ignite, filling the sky with smoke. When an Allied mortar round struck the spilled oil near sunset, it intensified the fire. Commander Nako ordered Tawaga to lead a northern attack on the refinery, intending to gain ground in the BPM plant's divided section along the Mosai River. Despite valiant efforts, Tawaga advanced only a short distance and lost many men. By nightfall, the Dutch and British had retaken much of the refinery, with bright orange flames casting eerie shadows. Still, some troops from the 2nd Raiding Regiment and 1st Rifle Company remained. Allied demolition crews couldn't fully destroy the refinery because paratroopers held critical sections, forcing the Dutch and British to retreat under cover of darkness. South of the Standard Oil NPM plant on the east bank of the Sering River, a thick marsh was where Lieutenant Hayes' 3rd Platoon landed. 2 men attacked a Dutch gun position armed only with handguns and grenades, killing 8 defenders before withdrawing to await the rest of the platoon. Lieutenant Hesby assembled his platoon and seized a native boat. He realized the marsh route to the refinery was perilous. After failing to navigate the marsh, Hesby dashed along a dangerous path, but was killed near the refinery gate, along with others. Sergeant Tamba took command, halted the frontal attack, and guided the remaining soldiers into the marsh to advance under darkness. Around 11 p.m., Tamba and his paratroopers found the refinery abandoned and dark. The NPM defenders had slipped away. The paratroopers at P1 and the 2 refineries held their gains all night, awaiting reinforcements. On February 15, 1942, at first light, Japanese soldiers from the 38th Infantry Division's 229th Infantry Regiment began landing from transport vessels sailing up the Mosai River Delta. British and Dutch jets launched repeated strikes against escort planes over the ships as they moved south. Despite multiple attacks, too many barges made it through, and orders were given for RAF pilots to leave Palembang and move to Java. An evacuation from Palembang was underway all night. The Japanese lifted the barricade near P1 but still controlled the airfield, with troops and snipers along the road. The Dutch set up their own roadblock near Palembang to prevent a Japanese rush into the city. Both military and civilian troops departed Palembang all night, and the next day, burning what they couldn't carry and fleeing across the Mosai River to safety. Refugees saw thick black smoke over the city from burning buildings and the BPM oil refinery. Japanese paratroopers spent the night listening to the Palembang evacuation. At the NPM refinery, a delayed Dutch demolition charge exploded around 6 a.m. Sergeant Tamba and his small group couldn't stop the fire from spreading, realizing why the facility had been abandoned. The Standard Oil NPM complex was about 80% damaged. Most of February 15th was quiet at P1 until 10:30 a.m., when a Japanese scout aircraft from Malaya's Kelantan airfield landed on the runway. Major Kamra immediately notified the pilot that soldiers were low on ammo and most supply containers had been lost during the drop. The pilot returned to Kelantan. This report was the first confirmation that the combat drop on P1 had succeeded. Minutes later, more arms and ammunition were added during the 1 p.m. reinforcement drop. Colonel, covered in mosquito bites, and some staff emerged from the forest around midday and were pleased with the progress. The reinforcement drop arrived exactly 1 hour later, with 90 troops of Lieutenant Mora's 3rd Rifle Company dropped onto the airfield. Oscar fighters flew combat patrol overhead as the 98th sent crew dropped cargo containers from Betty bombers. Lieutenant Adaki led a platoon toward Palembang after the second drop, distributing weapons and ammo. The paratroopers cautiously passed their own barrier and an abandoned Dutch roadblock, following the main route. By 5:30 p.m., they saw Palembang partially on fire and undefended. Two Dutch patrol boats, the P-39 and P-40, were near the river. One was disabled, the other fled. Lieutenant Adaki forwarded news of Palembang's undefended state to Colonel, who ordered Lieutenant Morisawa to secure the town with his detachment. Morisawa maintained communication with forces occupying the oil refineries. By early evening, the 229th Infantry Regiment had landed in Palembang, welcomed by 2nd Raiding Regiment paratroopers. 5 days later, the 38th Infantry Division took command of Sumatra's capital. The 2nd Raiding Regiment reviewed the previous day's events, claiming to have destroyed 23 anti-aircraft weapons, multiple armored cars and trucks, and killed 1,080 Dutch and RAF defenders, though these figures were likely exaggerated. The Japanese acknowledged losing 2 transport planes, 1 crashed deliberately, and 1 medium bomber shot down during the drop. Of 339 paratroopers dropped, 29 died, including 2 due to parachute malfunction, with many others injured, representing about a 23% casualty rate. Historians consider the raid on P1 and the 2 oil refineries both successful and unsuccessful. A U.S. Army intelligence report in October 1942 called the operation unsuccessful, exaggerating Japanese assault numbers and stating most parachutists were killed or captured and the Dutch destroyed 1 refinery. Later assessments reinforced this, but historians have since corrected some errors. Japanese tankers quickly returned home with essential refined oil. By February 24th, the 38th Infantry Division controlled much of southern Sumatra, with Japanese aircraft operating from P1. Most surviving Dutch defenders retreated northwest to fight a guerrilla war, with about 2,000 surrendering to the Japanese by March 28, 1942. The Japanese had firm control of Sumatra. Jean-Eric Lear, a retired police officer and Illinois social studies teacher, authored books on U.S. and Japanese paratroopers in the Pacific during World War II.